Society also has to eventually recognize that people vary normally so much that trying to redefine normality in a way that doesn't really correspond to human nature and to our evolved nature doesn't really work all that well.
I'm Adam Hunt, and this is the Evolving Psychiatry podcast, rethinking mental health through an evolutionary lens. Share it with the people who matter, like it if you like it, subscribe if you want to hear more.
Jerome Wakefield is a professor at NYU Silver, as well as an NYU University professor with multidisciplinary appointments. His clinical training and experience have been within the mental health field and were integrative. So he included psychodynamic, cognitive, behavioral, and family training, with work in agencies as well as private practice. For many years, he was a licensed clinical social worker in New Jersey. The main reason that Jerome Wakefield is Dr. Wakefield is here today is his scholarly speciality, which is really the conceptual foundations of many really important things in evolutionary psychiatry. So he's authored more than 300 publications, appearing in journals and books. He covers topics across philosophy, psychology, psychiatry, psychoanalysis, and social work. He's dealt with issues at the intersection of philosophy and mental health professions, very important work. And much of his recent work has concerned the concept of mental disorder. What is mental disorder? Especially how normal negative responses to a problematic social environment can be distinguished from kind of true mental disorder, and how current diagnostic criteria, especially of depression, fail to adequately draw this distinction. He's gained national and international coverage in outlets including Washington Post, San Francisco Chronicle, Time, the New York Times, BBC World News, the Boston Globe, many very prestigious places. So I'm very lucky to have him here today. And his work on depression, grief, and sadness, and the boundary between normal and disordered emotions, continues to draw media attention, and also my attention. So a book by Wakefield on this topic, written by Alan Horowitz, entitled The Loss of Sadness, How Psychiatry Transformed Normal Sorrow into Depressive Disorder, was published in 2007 by Oxford University Press. I think it's a great introduction to, or really a comprehensive overview of evolutionary approaches to depression and kind of where the difference lies between normal depression and disordered depression. We'll talk about that a little bit today. Jerry, thank you so much for coming on. I'm really looking forward to talking to you. So I'm going to start by asking you about your harmful dysfunction and concept of mental disorder, which is like your pivotal work. It's the thing that I always introduce to my students and make people really think about what disorder and what illness is. So could you just give us an overview of what harmful dysfunction, the harmful dysfunction analysis means?
Sure. Thanks, Adam. This is terrific to be with you here today. So, the field of mental health has a lot of fuzzy thinking in it, like all other fields. And when I came on the scene, it was still in the throes of several problematic debates. One problem was the anti-psychiatry movement, which was attacking the mental health field as being basically a social control profession. Not really a medical profession even, but just simply using medical jargon and terminology to justify medical intervention to control people who were doing things, behaving ways that people didn't like and didn't want to tolerate. Mm-hmm. This idea that psychiatry isn't a medical profession struck me as wrong. Now, like many people who might listen to this, I've had mental illness in my family, severe mental illness in my family, and I know that that's ridiculous. That's bunk. Of course there are mental illnesses. Of course there, to make a generalization, everything about us that is biologically designed, physically and mentally and emotionally, can go wrong. It can malfunction. So I started thinking about this, and in the context of certain studies of sexuality, of antisocial behavior, and other studies, I developed this way of approaching it. Now, within philosophy, the division was between scholars arguing that, look, mental disorder just is a value judgment about we don't like something, which kind of played into the anti-psychiatry criticism.
Right.
And then on the other side, there were people who just said, look, it's just a factual thing. If you're suffering or if you have certain problems, that's just a mental disorder. We can just define it objectively any way we like. Mm-hmm. None of this seemed to be right to me. Thinking about how the history of medicine has gone, it doesn't even matter that you know much about how people actually function in order to recognize a disorder very often. If you look at the Greeks and Hippocrates, his list of disorders are still all disorders today. They're just completely reclassified, relabeled, and we understand them a lot better. What is it they're seeing that can so reliably identify a disorder? And the conclusion one comes to is what defines normal human functioning is how we're biologically designed. It goes all the way back to Aristotle with final causes, his astonishment that an acorn consistently can lead to an oak tree. How is that even possible? Something must have created the acorn in a way that it leads to oak trees. Now, he had no understanding of that. He called it final causes. That's all. We don't know what it is. Religious folks called it God's intentions or God's design. It was Darwin who finally solved this deep problem of what it is that has created us to be so well adapted to our environment, to be so designed that hands grasp, eyes see, mouths talk, teeth churn food, and so on. How is this even possible? It can't just be an accident. Darwin figured out that it was natural selection. There actually is a process by which the end result came about due to its adaptive nature. This is a very special form of explanation, but it explains all the way back to Aristotle the notion of biological design. Right. Now, it seems to me that that is the only standard we have for saying people are normal or abnormal, is are they functioning according to biological design? Now, the social world places on that a filter of what's acceptable, what's demanded, what's good or bad. Right. Now, if your biological design goes wrong in some way, it's really irrelevant as long as it doesn't affect anything. Yeah. Each person is born with many mutations so that a certain genetic locus, a certain allele doesn't function properly. Nobody cares. I go out in the sun falling on my nose causes thousands of mutations in skin cells. Nobody cares. You don't have a mental disorder or a nose disorder or a skin disorder unless certain things happen that harm you. Mm-hmm. So you have to add to the biological design, which defines normality, so to speak, the harm criterion that defines when we care about normality versus abnormality to the point that we would call it a medical disorder if it's harming you, if a malfunction is harming you.
Okay. So yeah, you really put together these two components of what the philosophers call the naturalistic component, like the scientific component that we all want from a definition of mental disorder. You know, we are living in a scientific paradigm. We want some objective line to draw to say, hey, you know, this person has a mental disorder and this person doesn't. And before I think your work, people were sort of going about it haphazardly and just kind of really relying on values or assuming that there was a scientific explanation, you know, seeing, oh, this person clearly has a mental disorder and this person clearly doesn't. And there must be some scientific explanation, but I'm not exactly sure what it is or how to draw the line. And yeah, what you've done more than anyone else in the world is kind of point out that evolutionary history and that, you know, the design from our past is really like the best objective standard to look to say, okay, well, comparing, you know, what's happening to me to what would have happened to my ancestors, you know, would this mental state have served my ancestors in some way? And if it would have, then, you know, it's not a true dysfunction, even if that kind of mental state is is harmful. You know, you can think about aggression and jealousy, right, which are very kind of classic evolved emotions. They have very clear reasons. You know, you're trying to protect yourself from being cheated on, or you're trying to kind of combat others. And yet in modern society, it can be really harmful to express aggression or jealousy to like an extreme extent. You know, you can ruin your life basically. But that doesn't mean that they're a dysfunction in certain cases, even though you might get sent to prison, you might get ostracized, depending on, you know, the manifestation. So yeah, I think your work has really kind of brought to the fore the fact that you really need this evolutionary history. So a lot of what you've written about is depression, because you wrote this book in 2007 with Alan Horowitz on the loss of sadness, and kind of what you think about the increasing rates of depression in modern society, or at least the claim that there are increasing rates of depression. And you gave like an evolutionary analysis of sort of what's been happening to our perception of sadness, and how we treat sadness. And I'm sure everyone who's listening has kind of thought about this in their own sadness, because basically everyone will have been sad at some point, and really, really sad sometimes. And the question of when it's a disorder or not is something that, well, there's no really good kind of public consensus on. Or people go to psychiatrists and they might get prescribed, or they say, oh, that's depression, and people will disagree, and someone says, oh, that's not really depression, you're just you know, normally down. So anyway, can you just talk a little bit about what you found in doing research for this book and thinking about depression, and how your kind of assessment of depression kind of makes sense of the difference between disordered depression and sort of normal kind of sadness?
Yes, I think to put this in context, in psychiatry, to try to make it more scientific, the move in the American Psychiatric Association's official manual, it's called Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM for short. The move was to define in DSM each disorder according to symptoms, which makes sense. Medically, you recognize disorders very often by symptoms. Now, as long as you were dealing with people who clearly are disordered, let's say folks in an asylum, or who come to an asylum in the 19th century, the symptom approach was fine, it worked. The problem was when psychiatry started looking out at the community for various reasons and wanting to help people in the broader community, maybe people who weren't presenting themselves for treatment at an asylum, or who weren't severe enough to present themselves at an asylum, it became a different challenge, because it turns out that unlike the physical disorder realm, in the mental disorder realm, many of the symptoms that can indicate a mental disorder, if they're very severe, if they're not responsive to the environment, and so on, can be perfectly normal reactions to negative events in one's life. That's why we are biologically designed to have negative emotions, to tell us when things are not going right, to give us the motivation to change things, or sometimes, maybe with sadness, simply to withdraw and think about things a bit when things are tough and you've lost resources or you're disillusioned with where you are. So these negative emotions are clearly biologically designed. We see them cross-culturally. We even see some of them in various other non-human creatures. So they do things for us. But the symptoms, if you want to call them symptoms, the manifestations, so I'll call them symptoms even if they're normal just because they have a word, the symptoms of normal sadness are very similar to the symptoms of disordered sadness. So one thing about emotions from an evolutionary point of view is emotions, including negative emotions, are designed to enable us to cope with special challenges in the environment. And they change the way we think, the way we're feeling, the way we behave, the way we interact. They change everything to help us adapt to a new situation. So these emotions, because they're biologically designed and have all of these features, in a modern environment where demands are made on people, can be very inconvenient. And then they can be mistaken for disorders, and they can be classified as disordered and treated. And today you see, and so what concerned me was the unbelievable expansion of the concept of depression. Back a few decades before I wrote, residents were trained that maybe 1% to 2% of the population would experience a serious depressive disorder in their lifetime.
Wow.
Now, if you look at the epidemiologic surveys,
50%.
75% and more in a lifetime at some point will meet the criteria that are used in DSM. It's completely nutty. I mean, so that
where's the disorder if it's 75%, right? It's the 25% of people who are, anyway. Yeah.
So I mean, that it's gone from a severe disorder to people trying to defend it, saying, oh, it's just like the common cold. Everybody gets a common cold. Everybody gets depression.
Yeah.
But the question is it depression? And so how do you tell? One way is that due to historical circumstance, I won't go into, a lot of the symptoms that are used are very mild symptoms that actually are characteristic of stress responses that are normal. Things like, difficulty concentrating on what you're doing, feeling sad, having trouble sleeping. Who doesn't have trouble sleeping when something bad is happening in their lives? Most of us do. Symptoms like that. So when the whole idea of depression got started, the idea was in the asylum. You have all these psychotic individuals that are clearly disordered. How do you tell schizophrenia from depression? Well, if you're having insomnia and sadness and so on, those help you distinguish, because schizophrenics don't necessarily have that. But now you walk out into the community and you say, how do we recognize the people that have a disorder of depression? Those don't help at all anymore, because those are symptoms of normal stress responses to a difficult, demanding social environment, which we weren't necessarily biologically designed to handle. And a lot of us are stressed out and having various emotional reactions. So in this sense, how can you tell the difference? Number one, is your emotion still sensitive to the environment? Emotions, as I said before, are biologically designed to be responsive to environmental circumstances and to dissipate when the environmental circumstances dissipate. If you're chronically, seriously sad, irrespective of what's happening to you in your life, irrespective of the good or bad things, that's a signal that you should start thinking about that. Number two, are the symptoms characteristic of normal stress responses, or are they so odd and unusual and severe that you would be worried that something is going wrong? So, for instance, chronic suicidality, go see somebody immediately. That's not a normal response to life stress. What psychiatrists call psychomotor retardation or activation. If you're literally so slowed down that you have trouble even speaking at a normal rate or moving, these are showing that you're having what psychiatrists call a vegetative response that's slowing you down so much. That could be a malfunction of normal sadness, normal stress responses. Duration, if it just goes on and on and on. Now, normal sadness can go on for weeks or months, but as it goes on longer, it may seem that it's taken on an autonomy of its own. You're in a cycle.
Yeah, sadness makes you sad, which then keeps you in.
Sadness. Now, whether, let's say your sadness keeps you in bed, you lost your job, let's say. Right. Sadness keeps you in bed feeling hopeless. Being in bed feeling hopeless keeps you from getting another job. Yeah. And so you go deeper and deeper into this state. Right. To get out of that cycle, it's good to seek treatment.
Right.
So I think this is the sort of thing. There are criteria like this where you can think about, how do you tell the difference between a functioning emotion that's telling you something isn't good, I've got to rethink things, and it's responsive to that environment, versus something's gone wrong and now I'm stuck in going deeper without seeing any way of being constructive or adaptive in the long run.
Right. Yeah, you can see how our ancestors who undoubtedly felt depressed states of some kind, this is such a common human experience, are the ancestors who felt sad or felt, tired and depressed in certain situations, of whether it's like they're failing in social hierarchies, or they're being abused by someone, or they're trapped in a bad relationship. And you can see where negative emotion is a really important thing to have there, right? It forces you to change your situation. It makes people around you see that you need support. But then, that emotion could perhaps be telling us something in modern society, but it could also kind of start telling us something, and then, as you say, kind of persist indefinitely because we're kind of trapped in a situation which is completely unnatural. Or just the simple emotion itself could just go wrong. It could just kind of overactivate for no reason at all. Or just something biological's happened. But yeah, and it might be related to that adaptation, but it's not like it's an actually an adaptive response.
Now, some relatively normal responses, as you were pointing out, can become chronic in a modern environment. Whether you want to call it a normal response that's in a bad environment, or an abnormal response.
It's a normal, abnormal.
It's a complex thing. But one of the main variables that's been found is just one of the ones you mentioned, entrapment. George Brown in the UK and many studies found that in our modern environment, because of our rigid social roles,
right,
you can't just walk away necessarily. You can't just find a new environment. Although in a modern complex city, that's one of its attractions. You can find new groups, new people, and so on. But if people feel entrapped and hopeless, this tends to cycle their depression down more seriously. And on the other hand, to pick up on another thing you said, I mean, there's a famous study, I think it's a useful thing to keep in mind, a famous study of primate hierarchy fights,
yes,
where, and I think it's a good model. Why do we become depressed when, say, we lose somebody, or we lose a valued job, or a promotion, or our retirement fund gets killed by the company going bankrupt? These are all natural responses. Now take this as a prototype. You're a primate, a non-human primate, is in a hierarchy battle. Used to be the top banana, but a new, younger primate comes along and beats it. Now, the study showed that where the beaten one gets depressed, because they do get depressed, Darwin already noticed this, even the facial expressions are similar to ours, but now we have modern, surveys of their biochemistry, cortisol, and so on, and that was shown to change the way that humans change when they're depressed. So they're getting depressed, and guess what? They slink off looking depressed, and they hide out for a while, the way people do when they're depressed. The study showed that those that get depressed actually live longer, they survive better than the ones that don't get depressed.
Right.
Why? Because when you slink off in a new environment with a new top banana, you're not going to get into fights continually. The top banana is not going to think that you're still a threat. You can kind of lick your wounds and figure out strategically what to do next without being in the fray. So, we don't understand why we sleep for 8 hours and it takes a third of our life away, but presumably it has some advantage. Getting depressed sometimes and getting out of the fray for a little while seems to have some advantages we don't understand either yet completely, but there's some models for how it helps us to disengage from previous meanings and start to build new meanings that can make our life better.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's so much in modern society and our modern lives where the imperative is on you to act and change everything about your environment. Something's happened, you've just lost your job, and you really need to change. You need to go out and get another job. But in a hunter-gatherer situation, a lot of the time there's no options like that. And sometimes the best thing to do is just to do nothing. Like spend as little energy as possible. Don't interact with anyone. Just kind of wait out, because the environment changes around you. You'll eventually new people, you'll meet different bands, and you'll be able to go off with different bands, or you'll find a new romantic opportunity, or people who are bullying you might leave you alone, or whatever it is. And yet, I mean, the natural response to do nothing is it's actually quite harmful in modern society, right? Like you will end up just getting into this other depressed state, and you can't fix your circumstances. So yeah, the feeling better about not being able to do anything is perhaps one of the advantages of an evolutionary approach. And this leads me on to my last question, which is really important, I think, and it's something that your work, I think, does touch on a lot, which is like, what does this mean to people? What does the evolutionary approach to mean to people? What does the harmful dysfunction approach mean to to psychiatry, to patients, to their families? How do you think that we should be thinking about mental health differently, and how do you think it will end up kind of affecting those practical outcomes?
I think it has enormous implications, but let's face it, we don't understand mental disorders very well yet. So there's no magic, potion here anywhere in any view. But first of all, we are confusing normal human behavior with mental disorder because when it doesn't meet our social demands and social values. That's universal. Cultures tend to define normality in a way that supports their values, and it's a way of coercing people to be the way that they want them to be. And our expanded notion of depression, for instance, is now used. Young people tell me that if they're working and they lose somebody or they lose something, they get depressed for a couple of days, their coworkers tell them, go see a doctor and get an antidepressant. There's a lot of pressure to meet demands and to categorize deviations as disorders. Now, this isn't necessarily a good thing. And I think one of the consequences of this is narrowing the range of normality, narrowing the range of acceptable emotion in ourselves and our children and grandchildren. It's not a society that necessarily is an ideal one that we'd want to live in. So I think one thing is acceptance of the variety of human normality is one of the implications, a kind of understanding that we weren't biologically designed to perfectly fit our modern environment. We've developed a lot of incredible stuff, and it's great to be in a modern society. We can save ourselves from illnesses that we couldn't before. We can live in comfort in ways we couldn't before.
Air conditioning and heating and beds and rooms and food and
food delivered in Manhattan.
Yeah.
The point is that there's a cost for that, in that to the degree that we have deviated from where we were biologically designed for, which we have, means that we have to be sympathetic with each other, because there's enormous variation in people that's normal, and normal variation is not a disorder, and some people have more trouble with new things that society has developed and demands of us than other people. It means that people should think about how they are as people, their normal variations, and look for the niche in society that fits them. That's what we're all doing, right? We're all looking for the place and the relationship that appreciates us for what we are. And there has to be an acceptance that you don't all have to be the same thing, the same ideal. The social ideal doesn't apply to everybody the same way because there's normal variation. When we do have problems and we go see somebody, it may be that you have a malfunction of some mental mechanism, anxiety, depression, thought. Then you really need that kind of psychiatric intervention. But it may be that you're having an intense normal reaction to circumstances, and you have to understand yourself and understand why and understand what you can do about it.
So one of the things is, if you're in that situation, maybe thinking about those social circumstances first, right? Don't stay in the toxic relationship and go to the psychiatrist and get the antidepressant and then just sit in the toxic relationship and try and cope with it with the antidepressant. Maybe you actually need to leave the relationship, or the same with a job, or the same with, being stuck in a family home and having to kind of be around your parents who are, somehow negative influences in you, or whatever these common cases are. Yeah, the environment does matter, and medicalizing it and kind of pathologizing it in this way that, psychiatry is apt to today is probably missing that really important life intervention.
Absolutely. Now, one thing one has to always say in a discussion like this is, although psychiatry may have overshot the mark, if you have a serious issue of depression, you should see somebody and talk about it and figure it out. it's not something that should be ignored if it's a fairly serious and severe kind of feeling. But um, society also has to eventually recognize that people vary normally so much that trying to redefine normality in a way that doesn't really correspond to human nature and to our evolved nature doesn't really work all that well. And that we owe people the ability to be supported and to find proper social niches in which they can contribute and feel valued and feel good about themselves, even if they don't fit some particular ideal that our society has constructed. Right. So I think that kind of flexibility in all of us, understanding that we're the results, that normality varies amongst people, that normality has as part of it many negative feelings.
Right.
Teething when you're a kid, childbirth pain, to negative emotions like fear, anger, and sadness. These are parts of a normal life, and it doesn't mean you can't try to minimize them to have a pleasant life, but it means that pathologizing them biases how you're going to address them in a humanistic way.
I can see us becoming more forgiving, of our friends who are going through hard times, of our family members, and of ourselves. Ideally, employment and education situations would recognize that we're humans and we differ in all of these very obvious ways, and sometimes it doesn't perfectly fit the society that we want to build, where everyone is perfectly productive and happy and all the relationships are working well, and that's not what humans are designed for.
Right.
Yes, but yeah,
if that ideal of happiness makes a lot of people unhappy because they think, what's wrong with me that I'm not happy? So
right.
It's a recognition of reality, to recognize what we are really, and that takes some discipline because, as I say, it is in society's interest to bias our view of how we are to meet its own demands and expectations. Right. And so, to some degree, the individual has to push back a little against these demands and recognize and think about, who am I? What are my natural tendencies, and how can I realize them while being a reasonably productive and loving member of society?
Right. And I think, the evolutionary psychiatry community and people interested in it need to push back against it too, and just say, hey guys, this is unrealistic, and this is what's normal, and this is, you're misinterpreting this. And thank you, Jerry, so much for this talk, and kind of going over the key concepts in your work, which has spanned decades and is extremely impactful and has impacted me a lot, and a lot of my PhD is based on your work. So I really cannot thank you enough for that. And I'm sure that whoever's been listening to this will find some kind of insight and be able to apply it to their own lives. So thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Great being here.